Catch hype. Catch hype.
Hello, everyone. Do you love cat memes? Of course you do. They are everywhere on the internet. And even if you're not a fan, you have to admit, some of them are pretty funny. But what if I told you cat memes aren't just a modern day obsession? Believe it or not, they've been around for over 100 years. These aren't your typical internet memes. These photos were taken in the early 1900s by a man named Harry Whittier Frees. Long before Photoshop or digital cameras, Freeze was dressing up cats, posing them in tiny costumes, and capturing moments that are just as funny and bizarre as today's memes. Photos are creative and funny even now. It's hard to believe they're over 100 years old. But here's the question: why are we just seeing these for the first time? How do we forget the OG cat memes and the man who created them? To understand that, we have to go back to 1879 in the state of Pennsylvania. There is little information about Freeze's personal life. We do know that he was born in 1879 in Reading, Pennsylvania. His father was a saddle maker and his mother a homemaker. Freeze didn't set out to become the pioneer of animal photography. In fact, his career began completely by accident during a family birthday party in 1906. As the story goes, a tiny paper party hat was passed around until, just for fun, it ended up on the family cat. Freeze grabbed his camera, took a photo, and that silly moment turned out to be the start of something much bigger. And people loved the photo. It was so admired that Freeze began experimenting, posing cats in more elaborate scenes, and soon he was selling his photos to postcard manufacturers. Yes, postcards. All the cool kids were sending postcards back then, and Freeze's work became a hit. Now, you might be wondering, how did Harry Whittier Frees actually make this happen? I mean, cats aren't exactly known for sitting still, let alone wearing tiny costumes. Freeze worked in a time when photography had no tricks. He said his process relied on three things: patience, creativity, and kindness. He waited hours for the right shot, but even then, with the slow shutter speeds of early cameras, he could only use about 30 photos out of every 100 negatives. And his animal models weren't easy to work with either. Kittens were easily distracted by movement, so Freeze had to keep his studio fly free. Puppies were distracted by noise, so barking dogs were kept far away. And pigs, he ranked them as the hardest models to work with. But despite all the difficulties, Freeze loved photographing kittens the most. He found them to be the most versatile. So where did he find all these animal models? Freeze rented them from neighbors, breeders, and pet shops, and his own cat, Rags, often starred in his photos. Apparently, Rags was a natural, holding still for several minutes at a time. As for their costumes, Freeze's mother initially made them until his housekeeper, Mrs. Annie Edelman, took over. The costumes were stiff enough to help the cats hold their poses, but getting those costumes on was another challenge altogether. The work was so exhausting that even though he made a good living from it, Freeze only photographed animals 3 months a year. The rest of the time, he designed new sets and brainstormed fresh ideas for a shoot. Freeze said that thinking up new concepts was the hardest part of his work. But with popularity comes scrutiny, and Freeze was no exception. In the Victorian era, taxidermy was widely accepted, and some suspected that Freeze used stuffed animals to achieve the more complex poses. Others even suggested he drugged the animals. Freeze, however, insisted that all his animals were alive and well. He did not reveal his process in detail, but said he used small tools like forks to help the animals hold their positions or pins to keep costumes in place. A 1937 article in Life magazine speculated that Frees probably used concealed wires to shoot the photos, but also stated that no animal protective societies have ever accused him of animal cruelty, and in fact, some of them had praised and admired his work. What do you think? Throughout the early 20th century, Frees' photos were everywhere. His work appeared on postcards, calendars, newspapers, advertisements, magazines, and children's books. And not just in America either, but in Europe and New Zealand too. Frees' first book was Little Folks of Animal Land, and his most successful was Animal Mother Goose. With 250 pages of photos and stories, these weren't exactly light reading for children. But fan letters poured in. Yet, while his work was popular, Frees himself remained somewhat anonymous. As media evolved, postcards and calendars gave way to movies, radio, and television. Today, Frees is little more than a forgotten footnote in the history of American photography. Frees never married or had children. He devoted his life to caring for his parents, and upon their death, he moved to Florida and lived an isolated life. When he was diagnosed with cancer, Frees took his own life in 1953. He was alone and penniless, and his obituary didn't even mention his career or the legacy he left behind. And yet, his work feels oddly familiar, doesn't it? Harry Whittier Frees was doing something we still do today, using animals to tell stories, make us laugh, and reflect a little bit of our humanity. Cat memes are everywhere today, but Frees was the original creator, a pioneer 100 years ahead of his time. So the next time you share a cat meme, remember Harry Whittier Frees, the forgotten pioneer of animal humor. Share his story, celebrate his photos, and let's make sure his legacy isn't forgotten again. Thanks for stopping by. See you next time.